This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts today's show with an ag law update. He discusses the Swampbuster Act, Grassley Amendment, and the Foster case. The show continues with Romulo Lollato, K-State wheat production specialist, as he explains upcoming events where attendees have the opportunity to learn about wheat. The K-State Wheat Plot Tours, WheatRx, and in-depth Wheat Diagnostic School at K-State are all currently taking place or are very soon. The Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts round out today's show with a conversation about the value of birth weights. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and on this Monday, we begin our show with an ag law update. And in to do that update is K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us once again.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
So today we're talking about Swampbuster rules, which is something I had personally never heard of, but it is something that came with the 1985 Farm Bill. So what are these rules?
Well, you're right. The 1985 Farm Bill brought in the conservation cross-compliance rules. And in a nutshell, what those rules required was that a farmer, to be eligible for farm program benefits, had to have a conservation plan for the farm. And so we got all types of conservation programs that came along with the 85 Farm Bill, including the Conservation Reserve Program and including the Swampbuster rules. So what the Swampbuster rules basically said was that you can't convert a wetland, and that's going to be the key term, to crop production if you want to receive farm program payments. And there were only a couple of minor exceptions to that. One was for prior converted cropland. In other words, if you had already converted a wet area or what's deemed to be a wetland to crop production prior to the effective date of the 1985 Farm Bill, that was okay, but again, that led to litigation on that particular issue. But that was one of the exceptions. But basically, the Swampbuster rules say don't touch the wet areas, don't convert them to crop production if you want farm program benefits.
1985 was quite a few years ago, so a few things have changed since then, and there have been some new rules. What are those new rules and kind of adaptations to what was put in 1985?
Well, some of the initial rules that were put in defined what a wetland was, and you had to have three characteristics. You had to have hydric soil and hydrophytic vegetation or hydrophytic plants, plants that would grow in a wet area, and wetland hydrology. You had to have all three of those. So it was soil type and vegetation type and hydrology type that defined what a wetland is. And then in 1996, Senator Grassley from Iowa, who is still a senator from Iowa in the U.S. Senate, dealt with an issue by amending the Swampbuster rules to say that a delineation that's been made by NRCS of a wetland for a farmer couldn't change unless the farmer requested a new delineation. What was happening in the early 1990s, about 5-6 years into the Swampbuster rules, was that NRCS started using aerial photography to delineate wet areas and areas that would be wetlands. And so you'd have a previous delineation that would suddenly change on a farmer, and what was not defined to be a wetland now is defined because of aerial photography. And it was creating all types of uncertainty for farmers. They would start planting, here comes a new delineation, now this is a wet area, and they would have the rules change on them suddenly. And so Senator Grassley came in and said, no, you can't do that. We're amending the statute, and so this is a statutory change, and said that a prior wetland certification shall remain valid and in effect until the time that the person affected by the certification requests a review. And there was no mention, that's the end of the statutory language, there was no mention of giving the NRCS the ability to write regulations to carry out that rule, but they did. USDA developed a regulation known as the review regulation that set up procedural requirements that a farmer had to follow to make an effective review request. In other words, they were saying, well, you can't just request a review of us at any given time. You have to show that some type of natural event had altered the topography or the hydrology of the land, or you have to show that we made a mistake, or we admit we made a mistake. So those were the two conditions to getting a review. But otherwise, the statute said that NRCS had to do a new delineation if a farmer requested it.
And that kind of tees us up perfectly into a case you want to talk about called the Foster case.
Yeah, this is a case involving Arlen Foster. He and his wife, Cindy has since passed away. But they farm northeast of Mitchell, South Dakota, so kind of in that southeastern quadrant of South Dakota, rich farming country. And this has been held in Arlen's family for many, many years, almost 100 years. And in fact, back in the 1930s, with some of the initial farm programs, his ancestors were told by the government that there needed to be conservation trees put in to help protect the soil. This was in the days of the Dust Bowl and so forth. So they did plant these trees. And, of course, now those are very mature trees. And what happens is that the snow in South Dakota will build up next to and under those trees and then slowly melt in the springtime and would pond in the middle of the field and created what NRCS said was 0.8 of an acre of a wetland. And he couldn't do anything with that excess surface water. It was not attached to any type of drain system at all. There's no tile drainage. It doesn't drain into anything. It just kind of sits there, saturates the soil, and slowly has to evaporate and then saturate down into the soil before it becomes dry enough for him to plant crops, which about half the time, half the cropping seasons, he can't crop that area. It's just too wet unless he drains it out, manipulates it by getting the water out of there. USDA came in and said, that's a wetland, you can't farm that. By the way, you did, you're in violation of the farm programs, and you have to pay back benefits that you've already received. So he requests a redetermination pursuant to the Grassley Amendment. He did this along about 2008. That gets rejected. Comes back a few years later. He has an engineering report this time that had said that it's not a wetland, according to the civil engineers, and he had data provided that showed that the soil type, because one of the requirements to be a wetland, as I mentioned, is you have to have hydric soils. Well, the soil type of this particular area was not a wetland by NRCS definition. It was a different soil type. So it wasn't hydric soil. And you have to have all three of those requirements to have a wetland. And he's showing that, look, they don't satisfy one of these, so it cannot possibly be a wetland. Well, what happened was on the second go-around, NRCS basically didn't look at any of the data and said, well, you haven't shown any changed circumstances, the topography is still the same, therefore the redetermination is denied. And then that's what happens. It gets into court.
And this is something that started in 2008. However, it continued for many, many, many years and is kind of still going on today.
Yeah, the court said that the NRCS, he was challenging the ability of the NRCS to even write a rule because the Grassley Amendment does not say that the government has the right to write a rule here. But the court said that the NRCS could write a rule specifying conditions for review and that the rule they wrote was reasonable and that Mr. Foster hadn't provided evidence of changed conditions that would justify a redetermination. And you're right, this has been going on for in excess of 15 years. And now the question is, he's got several options here. One, he could request the full Eighth Circuit to hear the case rather than just the three-judge panel that issued the opinion a couple of weeks ago. Or he could petition the U.S. Supreme Court to review it, or he could just say, I'm done with this. And so those are his three options at this point in time.
And this is obviously an important topic for Foster. However, this is also important to Kansas and the whole United States because these laws and rules affect everyone in the United States. So what's a big takeaway for farmers?
Yeah, they do. That's a good point. And we actually have had Swampbuster cases come out of Kansas. So it's not an issue that's unrelated to Kansas. But anytime you've got surface water or a very shallow water table, you can get into these types of issues. But the broader issue, which will affect Kansas farmers, not just on the Swampbuster issue, but any time a farmer deals with an administrative agency, and it's usually for farmers in Kansas, a sub-agency of USDA, but any type of government administrative agency, you first have to go through their review process, probably lose that, before you can get to a court. And the standard a court uses to review an agency rule is one of high deference. It's a very deferential standard. In other words, the agency is almost always going to win unless their rule is completely unreasonable. It has to be arbitrary and capricious for the farmer to win and knock that rule out. Now, that's an important point, and it goes to the litigation strategy that a farmer might have. And it's an important point because just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court said that they would hear a case on the deferential standard given to government agencies. So that case won't be argued until this fall. We won't have an opinion until next year. And that could have a major impact if the court changes the rule on the standard of review for government administrative agency action for farmers and ranchers. And so we'll see what happens. But this case, it points out how difficult it is to do battle with a sub-agency of USDA.
And Roger, if people would like to read more about this topic, where could they do that?
There are two places. One is my blog, which can be found off the homepage of my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/Walter. Also, I share a lot of these, including this blog article, to the Ag Manager site through the Department of Ag Econ at K-State.
Roger, thank you so much for coming on and giving us an ag law update. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelby. My pleasure.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen discussing the Swampbuster rules and the Foster case. His article will be linked in today's show notes, which, as always, can be found on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break, but we'll be back with more. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. And this past week or so, we've talked a lot about wheat, and we're going to continue that conversation. And to talk about it today, we're joined by K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. So first, just to get started off, the wheat conditions across Kansas.
Well, it has been a really, really tough season this year. We're seeing a widespread drought that took place really since last fall. And with that drought, really a lot of the crop just is not even going to make. I think they were talking about historical abandonment rates across the state. And so really, really a year that will be in history there. I think not only because of the large abandonment, but in the remaining acres, a very limited yield potential as well. That yield potential is limited, again, not only because of the drought, but we also have a lot of heat stress that went on early May. We had freeze damage that went on late April as well, and parts of the state that got kind of hail damaged as well. So just overall, a really rough season for wheat, and with that, again, kind of expecting a low production and a large area abandonment. And what is interesting is that with that area abandonment that we're seeing around the state, it's kind of being reflected in our extension events now as well. This time of the year is a time for us to learn about wheat, right? We're seeing the wheat out in the field, and we're seeing how it's faring with those dry conditions, how the different varieties are handling it, and how the different management practices are affecting our yield as well. But with that, we have had probably about 15% of our wheat plot tours canceled just because there was no wheat to be seen. But a great time of the year for us to learn more about wheat and seeing what's going on out there.
So talking about learning about wheat, the Department of Agronomy here at K-State and K-State Research and Extension is putting on the 2023 wheat plot tours. And as this comes out, they've already started and are taking place. However, have a few more weeks of doing that. So what are the wheat plot tours?
Yeah, so those wheat plot tours are events where we generally go out there and with local growers and with in collaboration with the local crop agent as well, we are essentially discussing the crop conditions and having a chance to have the direct look at the different varieties that are there available for growers to plant next season, or perhaps that are just upcoming and will be available for growers to plant within a year or two. So across those extension events, right, we're right now, well, this year we had about 45 of them scheduled for the state of Kansas. And as I mentioned before, we had about 7 or 8 of them that have already been canceled just because of not having any wheat there. But total, we have about a 5-week time span. So right now, we're about halfway through with them.
What are some of the locations coming up for people if they want to attend? And in those locations, if they're planning to attend, what do they need to do?
Well, for those wheat plot tours, again, where we will discuss many of the existing and upcoming varieties, right, as well as crop conditions, right now we are still tackling kind of the central part of the state, right? So if growers are still in this area around Salina or around north-central Kansas in terms of Bellevue, and even move out west, Hayes, or most of the plot tours out in the northwest part of the state, they are still to go. Today, I believe that we have our last one in the south-central part of the state in Harvey County at noon now. But from there on, we should actually be mostly focused on central Kansas, going to the north-central part of the state, and move up to the northwest part of the state as well. It's interesting to note that these plot tours, they kind of follow the crop cycle and the crop development. So most of the southwest plot tours, well, this year they were mostly abandoned, but the south-central plot tours are kind of gone already, right? Just because the crop is already going through the later stages of grain filling, whereas we kind of want to see them as the heads are coming out and as it is starting to go through the flowering and early grain filling stages. That's why from here until around June 8th, we still have a good 20-plus plot tours scheduled, so definitely growers should be on the lookout for them. How do they go about finding that out, right? And we do have that out in our Extension E-updates, so that's listed there. Of course, I list this out on Twitter as well, so at KSU Wheat, or on Facebook at KSU Wheat. Absolutely reach out to your local county agent. He or she are the ones who are actually establishing these plots with their local farmers and putting out all the information about them as well. So, and usually there's a very nice meal to go with them as well. So there's another plus of attending one of them.
Continuing to talk about wheat and learning about wheat, the WheatRx schools, which take place in part with Kansas Wheat.
Yeah, so WheatRx is a new initiative that we have had, K-State Research and Extension, in collaboration with the Kansas Wheat Commission. And that's really a series of events. This is the first field day that we're going to have as part of the WheatRx program there. And again, it's a collaboration between K-State Research and Extension and the Kansas Wheat Commission. This will be kind of like a wheat plot tour, but on steroids, right? So we actually have many other things going on there, not only wheat varieties. In fact, this first WheatRx event is going to take place in Hayes at K-State Experiment Field there in Hayes at the research station. And on May 25th, right? So just tomorrow, actually. And we're going to start at 8 a.m. with just some coffee and registration. Any folks can actually register for that online. There's really no cost associated with it, just for us to have a head count in terms of ordering breakfast and lunch. Kick off the meeting around 9 or so with Gurong Zhang, who is the wheat breeder out in Hayes for Western Kansas. And he's going to talk about wheat varieties and promising lines for Western Kansas, and also how he's tackling wheat streak mosaic disease in his own program. Now, from there, we're going to move to a different station where Augustine Obur, who is our soil fertility specialist for Western Kansas, he will show us and talk about a long-term experiment that he is being responsible for running, looking at the interaction between tillage practices with nitrogen fertility, right? And how this has been impacting the use of wheat as well as the protein concentration on the long run, right? So very interesting things that can help our growers manage for yield and for quality as well. Following up on that, we will stop in the research programs that I have there in Hayes. And in those programs, we usually have an evaluation of wheat varieties and their interaction with management practices, right? So we're going to talk about seeding rate and how that interacts with varieties. We're going to talk about intensive management and how that interacts with varieties. We're even going to go into the environmental cost of intensive management, right? How much are we costing more to the environment to do that? And per bushel as well, right? We need to keep in mind that we need to feed the growing population, so perhaps we're costing more for the environment, but less per bushel, right? And we're going to go into that as well. And finally, Kelsey Anderson Onofre, she's going to talk about wheat diseases and managing for diseases. Of course, we don't have many of those problems this year, but she's going to be discussing that for future seasons. And we will wrap up that program with Lucas Hag. He's going to talk about the economics of wheat production, and that's going to be a talk more inside during lunchtime. So that program is going to have a light breakfast and a lunch, both served to the participants. And again, it's free to attend. We just ask that you, if possible, pre-register at the Kansas Wheat Commission website so we can have a head count and go over all of that entire program. The main objective of this WheatRx is to help our growers grow more wheat in a way that is more profitable and is also more beneficial to the environment. And that's why we'll be discussing many topics, from varieties to fertility and tillage to management by varieties interaction, all the way to diseases and economic.
And continuing to share knowledge about wheat, we have the in-depth Wheat Diagnostic School happening June 2nd.
Yeah, so that's another event that we are excited with. This event used to happen every other year, and for many years it happened in Garden City. Then from there, we started moving it around, and it used to be a 2-day event where many different specialists would actually demonstrate different problems that we can face with wheat production in the field. So we're keeping the general goal of having in the field and boots on the ground demonstrations so we can actually learn how to diagnose different wheat production problems, although we shortened the program a little bit. The last time that we had this program was in 2017, so it was scheduled again for 2019, and it didn't happen at that point in time, and from there on we have had COVID and everything, so for many years now we haven't had this program. So we're giving it a try with a little bit shortened version, which will be all on June 2nd instead of having a 2-day program, and we will offer 6 continuing education units for certified crop advisors and 2 one-way pesticide management or application credits, right? So for crop advisors who are looking for those credits, it's an excellent opportunity to accumulate many of them. This is also an excellent opportunity for young professionals who are wanting to learn more about wheat in depth, and more experienced professionals as well to get an update on what's going on the different sides of wheat production. The different topics that we will cover in depth with Diagnostic School, one of them is just simple wheat growth and development. How do we identify in the field what are the different growth stages of a wheat crop, and what are the management practices that we should be thinking about at those different growth and development to impact the different yield components that are being determined at that point in time. So again, a very in-depth demonstration of those different growth stages of the crop. We will also have wheat disease ID and management, not only management through fungicides, but also seed fungicide application, foliar fungicide application, and genetic resistance. We will have diagnosing wheat fertility problems with Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz and Nathan Miller from University of Nebraska. We will have weed control and application problems with Dr. Sarah Lancaster, forage and cover crop options with John Holman from Garden City, and wheat breeding technologies with Alan Fried. So many different things going on here for this in-depth wheat diagnostic school. Again, a great opportunity to get some continuing education units there, but not only that, to get an update on what's going on in the wheat industry, as well as to train young professionals in wheat production. There is a cost to attend the in-depth wheat diagnostic school. We're looking at about $120 a piece, and a little bit less than that if you are associated with Kansas State University in any way, shape, or form. But we're looking forward to picking up this program and perhaps having it every couple of years again.
We will link all the events that are taking place soon here at Kansas State University or with Kansas State University in today's show notes. Romulo, I appreciate you coming on and sharing some information for producers and how people can learn more about wheat.
Thank you, Shelby. I also appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And again, all this information will also be available through my Twitter and Facebook pages at KSU Wheat.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we finished this Wednesday's show with the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. We're joined by Brad White, Brian Lubers, and Bob Larson.
Hi, welcome to BCI Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White. Happy to have you with us today, and happy to have 2 great experts here, Dr. Brian Lubers and Dr. Bob Larson. Today's question from a listener is birth weight important? Brian, I'm going to go to you first.
This is a tough one because I mean, the answer is kind of yes and no. Despite what my wife says, I'm going to say no. It is important, but at some level, what am I going to do about it at that point anyway, right? And I'm sure my opponent will bring out why it is important, but I'm going to say it's something you can't change anyway. I also think that when we go to measure it, because you asked about measuring it, if you're measuring it, there's a lot of variability just within the measurement, and it's within the tight range of normal birth weights that we expect. That adds a lot, so 2 to 3 pounds of difference just in my measurement being off is a big percentage of what a normal birth weight range would be. So I'm going to say that's not something I'm going to invest a lot of effort in doing.
Okay, 5 points to Brian out of the gate. Bob?
Well, I think one of the things to clarify is whether this is a commercial producer or a purebred producer. So for a purebred producer, I think measuring birth weight is important because it's one of the genetic traits that buyers are interested in because of its correlation with calving difficulty. And calving difficulty is actually way more important to me than birth weight itself, but there's a strong correlation between those two. So if it's a purebred producer, that's the reason to measure birth weight, is to provide information to buyers. Now, if I'm a commercial producer, really all I'm interested in is calving difficulty. And I'm interested in the sires that are throwing more calves that have calving difficulty, those types of things. But then the other reason that I am interested in birth weight is, on the positive side, birth weight is positively correlated with weaning weight and yearling weight. And so if I were to make selection pressure too much towards small birth weight, well, I'm going to negatively impact weaning weight and yearling weight. So I think birth weight is important, but it's not a simple unidirectional big is bad. It's like, no. You got to hit the sweet spot.
So 6 points for Bob. As a follow-up here, and Brian, you mentioned that maybe is not as important to you. Is that because something else is superseding it when you're selecting, or what are some of your rationale there?
Well, it's important to know for like calving difficulty and things like that, but I kind of already know that. I'm thinking of this from the perspective, am I going to buy a scale? Am I going to calibrate a scale? Am I going to carry a tape? Whatever method I'm using to actually do it, and then the time to go do it. And I might be doing something all right. I might be tagging a calf. I might be giving it some colostrum. So it's not a huge, but for me, it's one of those activities. If she had difficulty calving, I probably already know that, and I don't need an actual measurement to tell me that, right? And if it's a huge calf, I can visually assess that. So I'm looking at it probably from the very legalistic perspective of, do I want to know what the actual number is, or do I want some more general information about the size of the calf? I just don't feel like it's one of those things where if somebody wants to do it, great. I'm not going to discourage you from doing it, but I don't actively encourage it. I just don't. There's not a lot of utility in that number for me.
And Bob, you mentioned birth weight's correlated with weaning weight and yearling weight, which is one of the reasons that you would like to know it. So how would you use that information to change your decision process?
I want to use it in my bull selection because, as Brian said, once the calf is born, it's born. So there's not any decisions I'm going to make after that, except possibly from a heifer selection standpoint, those types of things. Although really I'm going to use my bull selection. And so that goes back to the reason to measure this is for my purebred producers, the people I'm going to buy bulls from. I want them to be capturing this information, and I want them to be doing it accurately and provide me with information. That's very different than me as a commercial producer, first of all, wanting that measurement and what I would do with it. So I think my answer is yes, it's important for a purebred producer, not nearly as important for me as a commercial producer to measure that.
I think that's a great distinction between the two, and good comments from both of you. Bob finished up with 8 points. Brian finished up with 7. So thanks for joining us today. If you have any other questions, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, Brad White, Brian Lubers, and Bob Larson. That concludes today's programming, but we'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.